You've probably felt it before. That subtle irritation, that eye roll, that tightening in the chest, that quiet sense of, I'm not like them, even when they are almost exactly like you. Maybe it's someone who votes for the same party you do, but uses a phrase you find cringeworthy. Maybe it's someone who shares your values, equity, justice, truth, but expresses them in a way that feels performative, naive, or just wrong. Maybe it's someone from your own town, your own religion, your own generation, but who roots for a different team, follows a different trend, or interprets one historical event slightly different than you do. They're not your enemy. They're close. Too close. And that's exactly what makes them feel like a threat. That's the narcissism of small differences, a term first introduced by Sigmund Freud in the early 20th century to describe the strange, often disproportionate hostility that arises between people or groups who are fundamentally alike. It doesn't stem from vast ideological chasms. It arises from tiny fractures, hairline cracks in otherwise shared identity. It's not about enemies. It's about cousins, neighbors, friends, even allies. And yet somehow, those are the ones we fight the hardest. Why? Because difference, however minor, threatens our sense of uniqueness. Because sameness, when it isn't total, becomes uncomfortable. And because defining ourselves by what we're not often feels easier than building bonds over what we are. It sounds petty, small, harmless even. Well, mostly harmless. But it isn't. Because once that instinct becomes predictable, once it can be harnessed, inflamed, and manipulated, it becomes something much more dangerous. A tool, a tactic, a wedge. And like any tool, it can be used. Not just by individuals, by empires, by corporations, by governments, by media platforms that thrive on division and outrage. And most of all, by the billionaire class. Because they've learned something Freud never could have predicted. When people are busy resenting each other over small differences, they don't notice the big one, the real one, the one between them and us, the 1% and the 99. And so this quiet trick of the mind, this obscure theory from the annals of psychoanalysis, has become a foundational strategy in modern power. It keeps us suspicious of our neighbors. It keeps us arguing on the internet. It keeps us focused on language instead of laws, symbols instead of systems, and personalities instead of policy. It keeps us fractured, distracted, harmless. All while the real levers of power, the ones we should be pulling, remain untouched. And that's where this story begins. Power doesn't need your love. It doesn't need your trust. It doesn't even need your belief in the system. It just needs your disunity. That's the dirty little secret of the billionaire class. They don't stay on top because everyone supports them. They stay on top because the rest of us can't agree on where to look. See, unity is dangerous. When workers stand together, wages rise. When students organize, policies shift. When renters mobilize, evictions slow. And when voters act as a bloc, governments fall. When the many realize they have more in common than they've been told, the few start to panic. And that's when the system hits the panic button and falls back on its most reliable strategy, division. Not through brute force, though it still uses that when it must, but through something more elegant, more efficient, more invisible. Distraction, disorientation, disunity. They slice us up along lines that feel meaningful in the moment. Race, religion, region, generation, gender, political party, social status, even diet, red state, blue state, Boomer, Gen Z, urban, rural, progressive, moderate, radical, vaxxed, unvaxxed, pronouns, flags, hashtags. Do any of these things truly define our material lives? Do they decide who owns the land, the factories, the banks, the patents, the ports, the data? Not really. But they make damn good fuel for outrage. They make us forget that we're all trapped in the same burning building, just fighting over who gets the window seat. Because here's what we're rarely told. The biggest divide in society isn't between left and right. It's not between this group or that group. It's up and down. It's between those who own the world and the rest of us who keep it running. The people who control the capital, the corporations, the media, the land, the algorithms, the governments, and the rest of us, who labor under a system that demands everything and gives almost nothing back. That's the divide that matters. But we're not taught to see that one. We're taught to look sideways, to punch down, to blame the poor, the immigrant, the other party, the loud activist, the quiet neighbor, the wrong generation. We're taught to see our fellow citizens not as teammates in a rigged game, but as the reason the game feels so rigged in the first place. And when we start to get close to the truth, when we start to see the strings behind the puppet show, that's when the distractions intensify. A new culture war, new outrage cycles, a new scapegoat, a new label. Anything to keep us from looking up. Because if we did, if we all looked up at the same time, if we stopped shouting sideways and started asking the real questions, like why a handful of people own more wealth than entire nations, why corporations pay less in tax than school teachers, why the planet is dying while billionaires build bunkers and rockets. If we really looked up, the game would be over. And they know it. Which is why the narcissism of small differences, this clever, insidious twist of the human mind, has become the beating heart of the modern playbook. It keeps us distracted. It keeps us divided. And most of all, it keeps us predictable. Because a fractured public is a manageable one. But a united public, that's a revolution. Step into almost any conversation today, online or off, and you'll notice something. We're not talking about wages. We're not talking about rent. We're not talking about who controls the economy, who writes the laws, or who's engineering our futures without our consent. We're talking about pronouns. Mine are it and that. We're talking about flags. We're talking about who knelt during an anthem, who put what in their Twitter bio, who wore what shirt to a protest. We're talking about books being banned, cartoons being censored, movies being too progressive, or not progressive enough. And to be clear, some of those conversations do matter. Representation matters. Language matters. Symbols shape how we relate to the world and to each other. But somewhere along the line, those symbols stopped being reflections of deeper conflicts. They became substitutes for them. Because the culture war isn't designed to solve problems. It's designed to distract, to take minor disagreements and blow them up into existential threats, to pit neighbor against neighbor, generation against generation, citizen against citizen, not over policy, not over class, not over the fact that 70% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck, or that millions have no health care in the richest country on earth. No, we fight over aesthetics, etiquette, tone, emphasis. We fight over the surface while the system stays untouched. We rage over what words to use, while billionaires rewrite labor laws to make sure we have no words left at all. We argue over historical statues, while the architects of economic injustice build monuments to themselves in real time. We tear each other down for saying the wrong thing the wrong way, while the wealth gap grows wide enough to swallow the entire middle class. That's the design, because the culture war doesn't threaten the status quo. It protects it. It channels anger away from the powerful and redirects it toward the familiar, toward your coworker, your neighbor, your cousin, the stranger in your feed, the person who voted almost like you but not quite. It turns legitimate frustration into tribal performance, where the goal isn't solidarity, it's superiority. Not to fix things, but to feel right, to feel better than. And meanwhile, behind the curtain, the real decisions are being made. Deals are being signed. Rights are being sold. Wealth is being transferred upward, quietly, methodically, relentlessly, while we scream at each other about who uses the wrong emoji. The culture war is theater, and we are the audience and the actors, while the stagehands, the billionaires, the lobbyists, the executives, work in the shadows, undisturbed. During a global crisis, they didn't panic. They didn't lose sleep. They doubled their wealth. They bought more land, more influence, more insulation from the consequences of the world they helped break. They profited while we fought. They soared while we scrolled. They won while we argued over breadcrumbs. Because while the culture war kept us entertained, the class war kept happening, silently, invisibly, ruthlessly. And no one was watching. Or, at least, no one was looking up. You'd think that people fighting for justice, for a livable planet, for fair wages, for equal rights, would be on the same team. You'd think that movements built around freedom, dignity, and human well-being would find common cause with one another. And sometimes they do. But far too often, they don't. Instead, they fracture. Labor fights climate. Climate fights education. Education fights housing. Progressive movements turn inward, turning their sharpest criticisms not on the systems they oppose, but on each other. Not over core values, but over tactics, language, decorum. Who gets to speak, and in what tone, and with what credentials? Whole campaigns collapse, not from the outside attack, but from internal fracture. Splinters caused by disagreement over a tweet, a slogan, or a piece of messaging that wasn't pure enough. And make no mistake, accountability matters. Integrity matters. Movements must reflect the values they preach. But somewhere along the line, vigilance turned into purity tests. Dialogue turned into exile. And solidarity became conditional, reserved only for those who passed an ever-shifting checklist of ideological litmus tests. It happens on both sides, right and left. The irony, the people being excommunicated aren't enemies. They're allies, fellow travelers. Often people with the same goals, the same principles, the same deep hunger for a better world. But they phrased it wrong. They chose the wrong strategy, or they weren't perfect, publicly, performatively, and constantly. So they were pushed out, called out, cut off, and the movement grew smaller, weaker, more fragmented. And while this happens, while good people tear each other apart over nuance and nomenclature, what are the billionaires doing? Are they canceling each other? Are they breaking ranks over tone? Are they debating whether to fund the perfectly worded tax loophole? Of course not. They move as one. They don't splinter. They don't hesitate. They don't waste time fighting over how best to hold power. They hold it. They use it. They understand it. And when it comes to strategy, unity beats purity every single time. And so they build together. They fund bipartisan think tanks. They sit on boards of opposing political parties. They own the news that fuels both sides of a culture war. And they don't care about the ideological consistency. They care about control. While we argue over who's allowed at the table, they're buying the table, the building, and the land it sits on. They understand power, and they exercise it without shame, without apology, without the moral gymnastics that progressive circles constantly tie themselves into. Because while we hesitate, they consolidate. While we debate tactics, they write policy. While we audit each other's speech, they audit entire economies and extract every last drop of value. And here's the kicker. They love when we fight. They count on it. Because every moment spent attacking an imperfect ally is a moment not spent challenging the systems that keep us all trapped. It's not just a distraction. It's a feature of the system. A brilliant one. Because as long as we're too busy gatekeeping each other to build real coalitions, the existing power structure can go on untouched. Even worse, it can cloak itself in the language of progress, co-opt our symbols, mimic our slogans, and market itself as the very change we're too fractured to achieve. And we let it, not because we're weak, but because we're constantly told that perfection is the price of participation. That if someone isn't 100% right, they don't belong. And so the movement shrinks, again and again and again, until it's not a movement at all, but a circle, a purity spiral, a beautifully divided, ideologically pure, structurally powerless circle. Meanwhile, the billionaires keep building. And they never, ever stop. Modern technology didn't invent division. It didn't create tribalism. It didn't conjure hatred out of thin air. But it took those old familiar fractures, the ones we've carried for generations, and refined them, streamlined them, automated them. It took every fear, every prejudice, every insecurity, and turned them into data. Then it fed that data into machines designed not to understand you, but to manipulate you. And those machines are very good at what they do. Because outrage is profitable. Conflict is clickable. Polarization is sticky. The longer you're angry, the longer you stay. The longer you stay, the more ads you see. The more ads you see, the more money they make. It's that simple. That's Facebook's business model. But it's not just about money. It's about behavior, control, predictability. If the system knows what upsets you, it knows how to keep you engaged. And if it can keep you engaged, it can keep you divided. That's the real trick. Social media doesn't just reflect who we are. It shapes who we become. Bit by bit, click by click, scroll by scroll. It doesn't feed us what's true. It feeds us what works, what spikes cortisol, what keeps us hooked. It feeds us caricatures of people we disagree with, never the full picture. It trains us to see the worst version of our opponents and to assume that's the only version there is. It doesn't care if you understand your neighbor. It cares if you react. Because that reaction, angry, disgusted, self-righteous, is the fuel that keeps the engine running. It's not an information age. It's an inflammation age. What we're consuming isn't knowledge. It's emotional bait, weaponized difference, programmed tribalism. We're being fed content that reinforces the belief that we're under attack, not from above, but from each other. And the more we believe that, the more we stop looking up. We stop questioning the real power structures. We stop asking why billionaires own the platforms that push this content in the first place. We stop wondering why those platforms always seem to amplify division, but never unity. And when someone unites us, shared pain, shared struggle, shared demands, somehow those posts don't go viral. Somehow those movements are flagged as dangerous. Somehow those voices are throttled, shadow banned, or quietly removed from your feed. Because unity is unpredictable. Unity can't easily be sold. And most of all, unity is dangerous to those who profit from our division. Think about it. When was the last time you were served content that made you feel connected to people outside your bubble? When was the last time a trending topic was about mutual aid, worker solidarity, or global cooperation? Now compare that to how often you see content that makes you angry at the other side. It's not an accident. That's the algorithm. An algorithm that thrives on disconnection, that feeds you reasons to hate people you've never met, that starves you of the context that would make you understand them. An algorithm that doesn't just reflect our worst instincts, but deepens them, trains them, turns them into habits. And in doing so, it does the one thing the billionaire class could never do on its own. It keeps the rest of us fighting each other, so they never have to fight us. Because while we're busy debating tweets, memes, slogans, and sound bites, we're not organizing. We're not mobilizing. We're not building anything real. And if you think that's just a glitch in the system, think again. It's not a bug. It's the business model. Division is not an unfortunate byproduct of the digital age. It is the product. It's what keeps us docile, distracted, divided, and predictable. Because the more we see each other as enemies, the less we notice how much we actually have in common. The less likely we are to talk, to trust, to unify, which, of course, was the point all along. This strategy we've been describing, the divide, distract, and conquer playbook, isn't some modern invention. It's not new. It's not revolutionary. In fact, it's ancient. Because those in power have always known the same simple truth. Nothing threatens authority like a united public. Every ruler, every empire, every oligarchy, from antiquity to now, has understood that a population that sees itself as one is a population that cannot be controlled for long. So what do? They keep it divided. It's not just cynical, it's strategic. Let's go back. Colonial powers knew that their armies were outnumbered in almost every land they occupied. They couldn't hold territory by force alone. So they turned people against each other. They took pre-existing ethnic tensions and amplified them. They elevated one group over another, gave one tribe weapons, gave another land, gave a third just enough favor to stir envy in the rest. Then they stepped back and let the chaos manage itself. They didn't have to rule with an iron fist. They just had to rule through fragmentation. The British Empire called it divide and rule. The Romans called it divide et imperia. The Ottomans, the Dutch, the French, they all used it. It worked in India. It worked in Africa. It worked in Southeast Asia, in the Middle East, in the Americas. And when those colonial systems fell, the divisions they left behind remained, sometimes more deeply embedded than ever. They didn't just divide land. They divided memory. They divided identity. They divided people. But this strategy wasn't limited to colonialism. Inside empires, Rome for instance, provincial governors were encouraged to compete with one another. If Gaul and Hispania hated each other, they weren't going to rise up together against Caesar. If the plebeians blamed the freedmen, and the freedmen blamed the slaves, and the slaves blamed each other, no one blamed the Senate. That's the genius of it. If you keep the masses fighting over scraps, they never demand the table. They never ask who wrote the rules of the feast. They never notice the 1% of hands that always leaves full. And now, centuries later, we like to think that we've outgrown that. We like to imagine that we're too informed, too democratic, too modern to fall for such obvious manipulation. But look closely. The tactics haven't disappeared. They've evolved. Today's rulers don't wear crowns or carry scepters. They wear Patagonia vests. They sit on tech boards and talk about disruption. They tweet about justice while investing in monopolies. They don't run armies. They fund algorithms. They don't need colonial governors. They have lobbyists. They don't need to whip the slaves. They manage remote workers through productivity dashboards. They don't censor through fire. They censor through feed ranking. And most of all, they don't divide through bloodline anymore. They divide through branding. They turn identity into marketing segments. They turn political disagreement into revenue streams. They don't burn books. They flood the internet with so much noise that the signal gets lost. The crown has been replaced by a logo, the empire by a multinational, the sword by a smartphone. But the goal remains the same. Keep people divided. Keep them disoriented. Keep them blaming each other. Keep them focused on tribal disputes, cultural skirmishes, and personality feuds. Anything but the systemic roots of their shared suffering. Because if people ever truly came together, across borders, across race and religion, across left and right, and named the real source of their misery, if they looked up and saw the same small group hoarding wealth, dictating policy, owning the future, it would all fall apart. So history repeats, not as accident, but as design. And until we recognize the ancient playbook being run on modern turf, we will keep mistaking our neighbors for enemies, while the real emperors walk free. We are the 99%. Not a slogan, not a metaphor, a mathematical fact. The overwhelming majority of people on this planet, across all borders, languages, skin tones, and beliefs, share the same fundamental interests: to live with dignity, to raise children in safety, to have clean water, decent housing, fair work, and a say in the world we help create. We are 99% of the population, but we don't act like it. Instead, we behave as 100 warring tribes, each convinced that the other is the real enemy. Right versus left, urban versus rural, secular versus religious, white collar versus blue collar. We fight over statues, slogans, symbols. We fight online. We fight in comment sections. We fight at school board meetings and in the streets. Not for power, but for proximity to it. Not for justice, but for recognition, for status, for the illusion of control. And all the while, a tiny fraction, so small you could literally fit them into a luxury resort, hoards the means of survival. They own the farmland. They own the factories. They own the servers, the patents, the pipelines, the ports. They own the news, the algorithms, the medicines, the minerals, the debt. They own tomorrow because they've bought it up today. And we keep missing it because our eyes are locked on each other, not on the handful of hands tightening the noose. We turn our neighbors into caricatures. We turn disagreements into battle lines. We turn elections into cage matches. And while we trade insults, they trade futures. They count on this. Because this isn't just tragic, it's strategic. Divide and rule wasn't a phrase. It wasn't an historical glitch. It's a business model, a governance strategy, a psychological weapon system. Because as long as we see each other as rivals, we'll never stand together as equals. We won't organize. We won't march. We won't strike. We won't demand a new system because we'll be too busy defending our spot in the old one. As long as we're squabbling over scraps, we'll never question why there's a banquet above us, walled off and guarded. We'll never ask who built that wall, who profits from our exclusion, who calls us lazy while they reap billions from passive ownership. We won't revolt because we're too exhausted from fighting the wrong battles. We've forgotten what solidarity looks like, what shared purpose feels like. We've forgotten that a people united in common cause is a superpower. That mass cooperation, not mass consumption, is how civilizations were transformed. And that is the greatest cost of forgetting. Not just that we remain oppressed, but that we remain manageable, predictable, divided, and harmless to those who keep us down. They're not afraid of our anger. They're afraid of our memory. They're afraid we'll remember that we outnumber them, that their wealth only exists because of our labor, that their power depends entirely on our participation, and that the moment we stop tearing each other down and turn together to face the real architects of our misery, the game is over. That's the cost of forgetting. But memory is coming back, and with it, so is power. But it doesn't have to stay this way. This constant conflict, this curated chaos, this war of all against all, fueled not by necessity but by design. Because the narcissism of small differences isn't an unbreakable curse. It's not the law of nature. It's a pattern, a psychological trick, a sleight of hand so subtle that most people never see it. We've been taught to fear those who are just a little different, when in truth, the people who hurt us the most are the ones we never see at all. The ones whose power exists in the shadows, whose decisions shape the economy, the planet, the future itself, without our consent, and often without our knowledge. While we fixate on differences in language, culture, or identity, they quietly rewrite the rules. They privatize water. They commodify housing. They monetize attention, education, health, and even hope. They extract value from our lives and sell it back to us at a markup. And all the while, they whisper through their machines. Blame each other. Fear your neighbor. Fight amongst yourselves. But here's the truth. The narcissism of small differences loses its grip the moment we recognize it for what it is. Not truth, not destiny, but a trap, a false frame, a weapon disguised as intuition. And the moment we see through it, everything starts to shift. Because that's where solidarity begins, not with slogans, not with forced unity or shallow performance, but with clarity. Clarity that cuts through the fog of propaganda and reminds us what's real. That your enemy is not the person who speaks a different dialect, not the person who wears different colors, follows different customs, or has a different way of expressing their pain. Your enemy is not the poor person who gets a different kind of welfare, not the immigrant working long hours for little pay, not the activist with a different flag, not the kid with a different label. Your real enemy is the system that keeps you too busy blaming everyone else to ever name it out loud. And once you name it, once you see it, the illusion starts to fall away. You begin to realize that solidarity isn't about sameness. It's about shared struggle, shared labor, shared loss, and the possibility of shared power. Because workers of every nation, dreamers of every stripe, students, artists, nurses, builders, caregivers, black, brown, white, rural, urban, queer, straight, religious, secular, have more in common than we've been led to believe. We share the same exhaustion, the same pressure, the same shrinking wages, rising rent, collapsing futures. We've been told that our differences are unbridgeable. But who told us that? Who benefits from us believing it? Who profits when solidarity seems impossible? The answer isn't hidden. It's just inconvenient to those who hold power. Because once we stop fearing each other, we start trusting each other. And trust is dangerous to them. Trust leads to cooperation. Cooperation leads to organization. Organization leads to leverage. And leverage? Leverage is how power shifts. That's the secret they never want us to remember. That solidarity is not weakness, it's strength. It's not idealism, it's strategy. It's not about erasing difference, it's about refusing to be divided by it. Because our real strength lies in plurality with purpose. In knowing that we don't have to look, think, and pray the same to build the same world. A world where dignity isn't a luxury, where healthcare isn't a privilege, and where education lifts everyone, not just the already powerful. Where labor is respected, where truth matters more than branding, where power is held together, not hoarded at the top. This isn't just possible, it's necessary. And the first step isn't revolution in the streets. It's revolution in the mind. It's reclaiming our sight, our memory, our clarity. It's seeing past the labels, past the noise, past the propaganda, and recognizing, finally, who our allies really are. Because once we do that, once we reclaim our solidarity, we stop being manageable and we start becoming dangerous, not to each other, but to the system that keeps us apart for far too long. The real enemy is not your neighbor with a different bumper sticker, not the parent at the school board meeting who disagrees with you, not the coworker who watches the wrong news channel, not the protester with the wrong slogan or the preacher with the wrong scripture. No, the real enemy is the system that keeps both of you exhausted, suspicious, and on edge. It's the force that robs you of sleep, inflates your bills, and shrinks your future, that gives you someone to blame who looks just like you. It's the billionaire who bankrolls both sides of the outrage machine, feeding your anger, while hiding theirs behind gated communities, tax loopholes, and lobbying firms. It's the algorithm that knows exactly what will make you afraid and drip feeds it to you in personalized doses, training you to hate your neighbor before you've ever shaken their hand. It's the media empires that profit off of conflict and distraction, the think tanks that manufacture division in an assembly line, the politicians who'd rather you scream at each other than look up and ask who's writing the rules. It's the system that thrives on division by design, because as long as you're fighting your neighbor, you'll never have the energy or the clarity to fight the real enemy. You'll never question why your paycheck hasn't kept up with inflation in 20 years, why insulin costs more than your phone, while student loans feel like a mortgage on your life, Why housing is a dream for some and a prison sentence for others. Why billionaires tripled their wealth while the world burned, and you were told to be grateful for the crumbs. Because the truth is, this system is scared of you. Not you alone. You together. United, organized, clear-eyed. Because once we stop taking the bait, once we stop mistaking each other for the problem, once we see through the lie, the centuries-old lie that says power is natural, inequality is deserved, and injustice is just how the world works, we become more dangerous than any protest sign or ballot box. We become unmanageable because the system can't withstand a people who see through it. It can't survive solidarity. It can't co-opt a movement that refuses to be bought, divided, or distracted. That's why it fears you. Not when you're angry, but when you're awake. When you connect the dots. When you turn your back on the culture war and face the class war. When you realize that the real battle isn't left versus right, it's top versus bottom. And you're not in the top. It's the many versus the few. And they are the few. For all their money, their media, their machines, they are so few. And we are not. Once we realize that, we hold all the cards. Because real power has never been in the palace. It's been in the streets, the unions, the classrooms, the neighborhoods. It's been in the collective heartbeat of people who finally remember what it means to stand together. That is when the gears start to grind. That is when the narrative begins to crack. That is when the system stutters. And that is when real change begins. Not because it was granted, but because it was demanded by people who no longer are asleep, no longer afraid, no longer divided, by a people who see clearly, who act collectively, and who refuse to go back.